Welcome back to the Stratcom podcast. Today we have a huge honor. We're joined by Oana Lungescu, who is, of course, now Distinguished Fellow at RUSI. But prior to that, she's, I think, universally known, at least in the Stratcom community, as the longest-serving NATO spokesperson from 2010 to 2023. She was the first woman and the first journalist to hold the post. And during this period, she directed alliance communications, providing advice to two Secretary Generals, Jens Stoltenberg and Anders Rasmussen. And she was responsible for NATO's public messaging during key junctures in the development of the alliance, shaping the alliance's approach to Russia and China, and managing operations ranging from the Western Balkans to Afghanistan to Libya. Oana, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much, Thomas.
So maybe we can actually a bit begin by taking a look at the past, how you began your work at NATO. Maybe you can tell us about that period and how has the alliance changed during the period you worked there?
I actually started covering NATO for the BBC back in 1997 when I first came to Brussels, and when my bosses in London sent me to Brussels to cover whatever we were not covering at the time. And I told them within a few weeks, we're not covering the enlargement of NATO and the enlargement of the European Union. And they said, okay, that's interesting. Will this even happen? And I said, yeah, it's going to happen. So it was my privilege to be able to cover that extraordinary story of hope, aspiration, the extension of freedom and democracy and peace and security throughout Europe for the BBC for many years. And then in 2010, my predecessor at NATO asked me if I would be interested in following him, and then eventually I did. So I started in November 2010. Now, I don't know, you're not old enough, I think, to remember, but that was the Lisbon summit when NATO agreed on its previous strategic concept. And that was the time when Russia was described as a strategic partner that we were aspiring to have. Actually, then President Medvedev was in Lisbon at that time for a NATO-Russia Council meeting. And I remember we were negotiating with Medvedev's team and trying to tell them that no, Medvedev cannot have his press conference before the Secretary General of NATO and before President Obama, because they wanted to be out there and brief. You know, that's how proactive they felt they should be in NATO. But of course, those days are gone. We're now in a very different world. And I think the last 14 years, the last decade in particular, since 2014, the illegal annexation of Crimea, basically meant the end of that period of hope and aspiration after 89. And I think we're now in a long period of confrontation, and NATO has had to adapt for that and has been adapting in many different ways, in particular since 2014, obviously with the deployment of combat-ready troops, including here in Latvia and across from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea, with increased defense spending, with closer partnership with Ukraine, and also closer engagement with other like-minded partners across the world, especially in the Indo-Pacific. So yeah, it's a very different world.
You mentioned the necessity for the alliance to adapt its structures, adapt its bureaucracy, its mentality in many ways. How has NATO adapted its approach to communications? You began in 2010, a completely different time in terms of the technologies available, in terms of the information space we operate in. What have been the main changes there?
I think the one thing that hasn't changed is that we're stronger when we're together, and that also stands for communications. I mean, communications is a team sport, as we know. It takes all disciplines, it takes all allies, and it's not just about what we say, but especially about what we do. because if we say one thing and do another, then our communications has zero credibility, and actually it undermines our strategic narrative. So from that point of view, I was very lucky to have a small but excellent and very professional team at NATO, in the press office and beyond, and to work with our military colleagues across the chain of command. So this is and remains a huge strength that NATO has, and that we need to leverage even more, because we're much stronger when we're together also when it comes to communications. But in terms of how our communications has evolved, I'll give you just two examples about how we responded to Russia's illegal annexation of Crimea in 2014 and to the preparations for the full-fledged invasion of Ukraine in 2021. And there we went the whole gamut from debunking disinformation to pre-bunking Russia's actions and false narratives. So basically what we did in 2014, I think NATO was the first international institution to put together a sort of one-stop shop, a portal debunking the big Russian disinformation narratives called Setting the Record Straight. It's still on the NATO website and still being updated. Not going after each and every piece of disinformation down each and every rabbit hole, because frankly, we don't have the resources for that. And also we know that one of the aims of hostile actors is to make us spend a lot of time on dealing with each piece of crap, if you forgive my technical term, that they put out there just to distract us. So I think that was an important template for a lot of debunking efforts down the line. But it was hard for us to be more proactive at that time.
Why was that?
For several reasons. I think because some of the allies were surprised by what happened in 2014. I think we're probably collectively not as well prepared about Russia no longer being a partner, actually, and showing its aggressive intent. And so it took us some time to adapt. And it was also much harder in those days, if you think back to 2014, in terms of the platforms, the social media, but also our access to satellite imagery. It took us a very long time. Back in 2014, I remember a few months to actually be able to declassify some satellite imagery of the massive buildup of Russian forces along the border with the Donbass region of Ukraine.
Because it was deemed too sensitive?
Because the imagery was national. So we had to coordinate with the allies, because they didn't want to reveal their tactics and techniques and procedures. So it had to be sanitized. So there was a lot of effort. And I remember we managed to do one briefing in August 2014 together with our colleagues in SHAPE with the imagery, but it took us a very long time and we were not really able to replicate it after that. But of course, fast forward to 2021, a lot has happened also in terms of the availability of satellite imagery that's commercial. Maxar and lots of other... Exactly.
And order those images right now.
Order those images right now. You can use them. You can analyze them. You can the appearance of OSINT and citizen journalists and people. Obviously the war in Ukraine is broadcast live from the front. We've never seen anything like that in history. But what I think we took a big and important decision at the end of 2021 when we started getting the intelligence briefings about Russia's buildup, Russia's capabilities, and what we assumed was Russia's intent. And together with allies, with the US, with the UK, the Secretary General decided to declassify unprecedented amount of intelligence, which had never been done before, to actually expose what Russia was doing on the ground, to call out Russia, but also to create a sense of understanding and unity among our own audiences and decision makers about what was actually happening, which was the basis for the unity that we have to this day in terms of supporting Ukraine and also showing who is the aggressor and who is the victim. So I think that road from debunking to pre-bunking is very important. It shows the evolution in NATO being much more proactive in its messaging and in its approach to countering disinformation and in trying to inoculate our audiences before they are exposed to that disinformation, because then it may be too late.
And do you anticipate that this is a trend that we will continue to see, that even, intelligence agencies, which are notoriously protective over, and their sources, their techniques, everything, that even they would become more flexible in this regard?
I think that's a great question, Thomas. I think we've set a template, together with the US, with the UK. The US is calling it strategic declassification, which of course it is. I think both the US and the UK still continue to do that, and NATO to a certain extent. And you've seen that, for instance, when it comes to exposing the type of equipment, dual-use equipment, that China is supplying to Russia in its war against Ukraine. So putting the facts out there about what is actually happening. Or the type of support that North Korea and Iran have been providing. So that's where you can see that. The UK also does a great job practically every day on X, formerly known as Twitter, posting the 3 key points based on declassified intelligence of what they see happening on the front. For instance, the other day, making clear that Russia has suffered 500,000 casualties, killed and injured, which is a huge amount of people in the meat grinder. So I think it's set a template, but of course it takes political will, and it takes a relationship of trust between communicators and the intelligence community. And I think that's something that we need to build throughout, and to have it when you need it. Not just, go to the intelligence community and say, hey, I'd like to use some of your prize assets like now. They need to trust that you know what you're doing. You have the political judgment. You will follow their guidance about what you can do and what you can't do. And then to see that it works and that it has an effect.
You mentioned how the relationship between NATO and Russia has really, spiraled, deteriorated in, every way imaginable. In the 90s, Russia even 2000s, Russia was seen as a strategic partner. There was seen as potential to cooperate on shared threats like terrorism or maybe climate change and things like that. Why do you think Russia turned away from this partnership? What happened?
Look, I'm not going to look into the mind of the Russians, and I think it's for them to answer that. But of course, there's a long history of Russian imperialism and what you see now is sort of neo-imperialism. And, you and I come from Central and Eastern Europe, and I think we sort of know it in our bones. What Russia's nature is in terms of its project. But of course, we also know that if Russia loses a war, as they did in Afghanistan in 1989, that can also lead to reforms and changes, because it's so I don't buy this narrative that is out there that a nuclear power such as Russia can't lose wars. Of course they can. They have. And they should. Because this could also be a catalyst for democratic reforms that Russia needs to become a respected member of the international community as they want to be. I would also say that obviously the story of NATO-Russia partnership is decades long. NATO actually signed the NATO-Russia Founding Act before it enlarged to the first 3 countries, Poland, the Czech Republic and Hungary in 1997. So I think sometimes we forget and we blame ourselves too much for Russia's actions. I don't think that we need to find any pretext for Russia's actions. But I can tell you, also explaining the surprise that perhaps many allies experienced in 2014, that literally in the days before Russia's legal annexation of Crimea, we were working in the NATO-Russia Council on the first joint maritime operation of the NATO-Russia Council, which was NATO and Russian ships together escorting the US ship, the Cape Ray, which was supposed to dispose of Syrian chemical weapons of mass destruction. So that was on the table with Russia at the time. So then Russia threw it away, and NATO still still maintained political dialogue with Russia until January 2022, when we invited Russia to a NATO-Russia Council. We tried to set up a process to find a way to deter Russia from going to war, but obviously Russia was set on war.
I imagine one of the kind of constant, exhausting battles that you've had to undertake while working at NATO is responding to Russian disinformation narratives about NATO. And I was wondering if you could maybe, in kind of as simple terms as possible for our viewers, debunk a couple of those or try to respond to them. The first one is, of course, one that we hear constantly in the context of Russia's war against Ukraine. And this is something that is still floated sometimes on social media, even in this country, is that actually it's the prospect of NATO enlargement that provoked Russia to invade Ukraine, that kind of forced Putin's hand, that he could not bear the idea of having NATO bases, NATO infrastructure kind of encircling Russia. Well, I'm curious, what would you say to that?
Well, Russia's invasion of Ukraine actually started in 2014 with the illegal annexation of Crimea that we discussed, when actually Ukraine had taken out of its constitution its aspiration to join NATO. It was a neutral country through its constitution in 2014. Its only aspiration at the time was to continue its partnership with NATO and to sign an EU association agreement, which was in fact the trigger for the collapse, for the Euromaidan, and then the Russian intervention. So it's a clear lie that this is anything to do with NATO. It's to do with Russia's aggression towards Ukraine. And the other point is that even if at the time Ukraine had wanted to join NATO, well, every country has the right to choose its own path. And that is enshrined in every document that Russia has signed, from the OSCE Helsinki Final Act to the Paris Charter, in the NATO-Russia Founding Act, and in the UN Founding Charter. Russia has also committed to not using threat force and the use of force against other countries. So Russia is in breach of all its international commitments. So it's a total lie to say that this is because of NATO. It's Russia's aggressive choice.
And maybe one other narrative in this kind of genre. It's a classic, which I think is kind of sometimes reheated and remolded in different forms, which is that actually, sure, NATO is an alliance of many countries, but this is just symbolic. It's really an imperialist tool of the U.S., that it's actually just a vehicle that the U.S. uses to dominate Europe, to project power, and that, these little European countries that are also seated at the big table, they're no more than mere puppets in this project.
Well, there are 32 allies around the table now. Finland and Sweden have just joined in the last 2 years. And who would have thought so before Russia's invasion? It was absolutely unthinkable, unimaginable. And they joined the alliance because they wanted not to be alone. So after decades of neutrality, they chose NATO and actually showed that Putin's strategic failure in Ukraine, which was to have less NATO on his borders, he's now having more NATO on his borders. Around the table, all allies are equal, have an equal say, regardless of how big or small. What matters is that NATO only works through consensus, which means that any country may delay a decision or shape it as it suits its own national interests, because these are all democracies around the table. So consensus can sometimes be a bit messy. It can take a while, but at the end of the day, everybody, if everybody agrees with the decision, NATO is much stronger.
Before we conclude, one final topic, which is maybe a bit sensitive, but I want to take the opportunity because you do not formally speak on behalf of all of NATO. So you worked for the alliance for so many years, and as you said, those who come from countries of Central Eastern Europe, they maybe have a more kind of instinctive understanding of the threat posed by Russia. At the same time, prior to this full-scale invasion, this sort of instinctive understanding was sometimes seen as, potential Russophobia or some sort of unwarranted trauma and so forth. How do you feel the credibility of Central Eastern European voices, perspectives? Has it grown within NATO? Have these concerns been kind of fully legitimated, or?
Yeah, I think there's been an evolution there in clearly in how Russia is seen and how Russia's intentions and capabilities are seen within the alliance. And yeah, back in 2014, I remember there were Western allies who are asking, well, how do we know that those men in uniforms without insignia in Crimea are actually Russian soldiers? Which was an interesting question to ask, because, of course, part of the issue is also not just of perception, but also of political will. Because if you see something and you call it for what it is, then you need to do something about it. So I think, in a way, perhaps also our public opinions weren't prepared to do something about it as much as maybe we needed to do at the time, but still over that decade we have gone a very long way. I think what you see basically is a united alliance, the strategic concept which was agreed in Madrid in 2022, just after the full-fledged invasion of Ukraine, states very clearly that Russia is the most direct and immediate threat to the Euro-Atlantic security, and it also, I think, it has a much more clear-eyed view of the world as it is, not as we would want it to be, because it also describes China not as an adversary, but as a challenge to our interest, security, and values. And it also talks about climate change as an existential defining risk. So. Ultimately, we live in a very dangerous world. I think the role of allies from the Baltics, like Latvia, which I think is a very clear voice, very clear position, very clear contribution, and is a very committed ally. Those voices are heard for what they are, and they play an important role in shaping not just the present of the alliance, but also its future.
And just final point on this, do you feel that there's any kind of merit to the idea that still, despite all this, some Central Eastern European allies get overlooked in the race for, let's say, top jobs within the alliance? Do you feel that there is still a bit of this feeling somewhere in the ether that, maybe we can't trust them completely yet with such responsibility?
I don't think it's an issue of trust. Actually, I would really put pay to that. Obviously, I'm fully aware of all the conversations, but actually, NATO right now has an Eastern European Deputy Secretary General, Mircea Joană, who comes from Romania. So, and he is the most senior Romanian official in the world, in an international institution. And of course, there's lots of Central and Eastern European senior officials in the EU, for instance. And we've had lots of very capable Baltic senior colleagues in NATO, and I'm sure we'll continue to do so. So I don't think it's anything to do with that. I would actually hope that NATO manages to come to a conclusion, NATO allies, on the next Secretary General, sooner rather than later, because I think this is in itself a message of deterrence. It shows that we're clear, we're strong, we're united, and I think it's important that that decision does not get tangled up with the discussions on positions in the European Union after the EU elections, or indeed with the US elections. So I think it's part of a package about signaling NATO's ability to take decisions and to take them fast when it matters. And this is a moment when it really matters.
Oana, on this uplifting note, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much, Thomas.